Listen, I think a lot of rules of the way that our little ecosystem works are changing very quickly. What looks to be escape velocity, if you were to assume that was something unique and endemic, seems to be much more shared by maybe 5 players in a given space.
David Waltcher is a world-class VC
who's worked for Firstmark and Accel,
where he invested in legendary companies like Klaviyo and Monzo.
Do you feel that in the future companies will be hiring more or less developers?
In the near term, you're seeing a
Welcome back to Decoded. My name's Alfie, Whattam, and this is the show where I speak to experts about what it takes to build great teams and companies. Make sure that you click the follow or subscribe button for more great content like this, and I hope you enjoyed the episode.
So David, you've invested in Freshworks, Monzo, BrowserStack, and so many more massively successful companies. What do you look for when you're deciding to invest in a startup?
It's a fascinating question. I would say it certainly depends on stage. Over my career, I've done early and growth stage investing. I would say at the earlier stages, I mostly look for extreme founder market fit. And so that's people that know their problem space they're in better than anyone, people who have a more informed opinion than anyone, and people who can articulate a solution better than anyone. And I find that usually lends itself to being able to do all of the most important things that a CEO has to do, which is carry a vision, be able to hire people, be able to win over investors and continue to raise money for the business, and then sell to customers, right? Like all of those things very much convey themselves in conversations that CEOs tend to have with all of their different stakeholders. At the growth stages, I think what you're mostly trying to do is ascertain category leadership and escape velocity. And that is a very different type of calculus. I find that in growth investing, folks that are looking at rounds or trying to make decisions usually have an array of options that all may have their pros and cons and may actually look more similar at a given point in time. And what they're trying to do is glean through customers and through data and through even sound bites that they hear, be it on social media or through direct conversation, by talking to ex-employees. Does this company have the sort of special characteristics that make it a leader and that will yield the sort of compounding return that you tend to see in valuable markets that come from companies that lead those categories. And so, I mean, there are countless examples of this. I think over the course of tech and venture capital, certain markets, I'd say most markets have been winner take most. In some cases, we've seen markets that have yielded, call it 3 to 5 real winners that have returned venture funds. But generally speaking, all growth investors are looking for that category winner dynamic. And certainly there's a lot more that goes into it, but those are sort of the two things that I've very much carried with me across both stages of investing.
Okay, so in the early stages, you were spot on with founder market fit with someone like Tom at Monzo. Having done Starling beforehand and effectively built the early versions of that app, I believe he was able to very, very comfortably take that knowledge and turn it into what he'd built in the next business. And then I believe he did go cardless beforehand as well, which was also in the fintech space. What about people that don't have that domain knowledge? Like, would you invest in a pre-seed or a seed stage founder who's building in a market where they've never worked before and they don't maybe have that founder market fit per se?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think it depends on what your definition of having worked in a market is before, right? Like you have folks like Tom who very much were fintech builders before building a incredible fintech company. But then you also often have people who, let's say, are building a space for a certain practitioner. Maybe you're building a product for salespeople, and maybe you were a salesperson before. So on the one hand, yes, have you built a sales company prior? No. Have you built a B2B software product? No. But you might understand that problem space and that domain knowledge better than many people that are building in your space because you've actually done the work of the person and the persona that you're trying to sell to. So I think, I mean, look, we try our darndest to maintain a very high bar for ascertaining founder market fit. And your question, like you know, especially now, I think more than any time, at least in my venture career, for any given interesting problem, there tend to be at least 5 companies that are going after the same thing. And so you can often compare many different founder archetypes that are going after the same opportunity concurrently. And so if you're diligent about maintaining that sort of tight feedback loop with yourself, whether you invest in a space or not, you can often see the ways in which those prior experiences, whether they converge or diverge across founders, lead to important things that happen over the course and arc of a company that create enterprise value and make an investment ultimately successful or not. So look, it's not entirely an answer to your question. I think it always depends. And what's awesome about founders is everybody is super unique, right? And so regardless of your experience, sometimes there are just intangible things that you either have or you don't that come through in conversation. But I would say generally that is the framework that at least I use for figuring out founder market fit.
Yeah, I've done a similar level of mindset when making my own angel investments, and as a founder myself, I was a recruiter for 10 years, and now I'm building an AI recruiter agent. So that knowledge allows me to build these tiny little 1% improvements into the product, which somebody that is not from that domain would have no idea even where to begin. So it's so true what you're saying. You mentioned around winner takes most, and that definitely is the case at the moment in software. Certainly in B2C, B2B can be a little bit more fragmented, but usually there is a clear market winner that often can take 80% or more. It really is quite crazy. Do you think that'll be the same in an AI world though? Because it seems to be a little bit different in some respects now that it's a lot easier to make a new product. I kind of feel like we're almost entering the fast fashion era of SaaS as these tools become
Sam
quicker
Altman
and
said
quicker.
that. Yeah. Listen, I think a lot of rules of the way that our little ecosystem works are changing very quickly. I don't have necessarily the answer, but what I will say is you are absolutely right that what looks to be escape velocity, if you were to assume that was something that was unique and endemic to a category winner historically, seems to be much more shared by maybe 5 players in a given space. And so let's take I'll take an interesting example. In the wake of Scale's acquisition, we've seen a lot of players that are building sort of these human data talent marketplaces. I'm sure many of your viewers will know some of those names. A lot of them have been written about between Mercor and Surge and Micro One, and all of them are doing super well right now, right? And all of them have the type of growth curves that if you were a software investor in 2018, if you saw a company with that sort of growth curve, your jaw would drop. And actually, your jaw probably still drops today, right? But I think the point is, if you talk to any of those companies, what's really interesting is there's so much demand for the service that they're providing that actually it's not a zero-sum game right now. Most of the orders that they're fulfilling from these large AI labs couldn't be fulfilled by one company. And so there are a ton of really interesting competitive dynamics, and that's a super specific example. But I think there are a lot of really specific markets right now that have just so much demand that you don't really feel a constraint in near-term ARR. And so it's much harder again to figure out, are these things going to be winner take all, winner take most? Are they going to have multiple winners? My hunch is that as we mature and as I think the rate of change and innovation slows down, or at least the shock factor of everything that's new slows down, we'll see a lot more return to normalcy in terms of the dynamics that create compounding growth for category winners and deceleration for non-winners. But we're just super early on in this new market that we're in, and I think that will take some time to bear out.
This is a quick message to tell you about my company, Alpha AI. We built Lisa, the world's first AI-powered recruiter who screens candidates for you on autopilot. You can make your recruitment process 10 times faster, 90% lower cost, and significantly improve the candidate experience, all with our AI agent for hiring. Learn more at welovealpha.com or click the link below in the description. And now, back to the episode.
You spent 6 years at Excel before your role at Firstmark. Are there one or two things that you learned from your time there that you've carried into the new position?
Yeah, I mean, two would be a drastic understatement.
Sure.
So many things. I mean, maybe to pick a couple that I definitely carry with me. I'd say one, there's no one way to do venture. Everybody has their own style. I grew up at Excel in my early 20s under 6 or 7 Midas list, perennial Midas list investors. And one of the most fascinating things about doing that was just seeing the ways in which they were so different in what they like to invest in, how they like to invest, the sort of founders that they were attracted to and wanted to work with, even the way that they managed a calendar and thought about where to spend time and where not to. And um, among many things about this career that I think are amazing, it's definitely that notion that in venture you are sort of in control of your own calendar and your own destiny, and you have to do it in a way that works for you and in the style that feels authentic to you, because otherwise you'll be just completely drained. And so I've definitely carried that with me. The second thing is we're in the people business. This job requires a very interdisciplinary mindset between understanding business models, understanding technology, but ultimately, you can be the smartest technical person, you can be the smartest financial person, but if you aren't an incredible people person, you're just never going to be a compelling investor, right? Because we are in fundamentally an asset class where the asset chooses the investor, which is pretty unique, and therefore you have to start and end with relationships. And that was something that I mean, truthfully, I think that was the reason I was hired there in the first place. I certainly didn't have the technical skills or the financial background to have a career there early on. um yeah, and then maybe the last thing is just, you need to be right for 10 years and not for 2, and that's something that I think today you especially have to remind yourself of in a market like this. There are crazier growth curves than we've ever seen among many companies in market right now, and certainly a lot of those companies are going to go on to build multi-billion, maybe trillion-dollar businesses. But importantly, like, a big part of this job is not just chasing that heat, so to speak, but really having a thesis about where the world will be in 10 years and how players today will shape that world and be a part of it. And so, we've just seen a lot of different cycles of companies participating in the venture markets, being right for a near or short-term time frame, but ultimately not having the long-term tailwinds and kind of derivative compounding growth to be stewards of a new market. And that is the business that we're in, trying to find those companies and invest in them.
Yeah, I mean, some of those companies that are going through that exponential growth that you've talked about, whether that's like a Lovable or a Bolt or a Replit, I mean, I'm sure that, like you said, many of those will go on to become massively successful businesses. But many of them, who knows if that ARR is truly sticky and if it will go away if something better comes around. It seems like the market's shifting so quickly. But specifically within those code gen tools, on a recent podcast, you said that 82% of engineers are already using AI to write code. And I'm sure that number is probably even higher than when you said that a few weeks or a few months ago. So do you feel that in the future, companies will be hiring more or less developers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think fewer developers, at least in the traditional sense, and that's probably the key part of the phrase. What I think we'll actually see is just very different roles that will start to bleed into the typical work that we assign to developers, or that we think of as quote unquote development. And so a much more holistic, full stack, true product design engineering marriage that lends itself to people that maybe don't have a CS background or don't have a programming background, but very much understand at a high level product systems design, and can make use of many of the tools that you just mentioned, in the same way that developers might have, committed code 10 years ago and built a product. And so that is at least the trend that I am hearing most among many of the engineering leaders that I speak to, many of whom are on the cutting edge of using the latest and greatest across CodeGen and broader AI engineering tools. Yeah, so it's fascinating. I mean, one of the I think you're alluding to Matt's podcast. One of the things that we talked about was just that computer science degrees have a lower employment rate coming out of college right now than art history majors. So in the
Really?
near term, you're seeing a certainly like a contraction in demand for engineers, but also we're in sort of this really, really, really fast moving and fast changing market. And I imagine at some point we'll reach an equilibrium where that stat probably will not hold over the next 5 years. But it also gets to a question of like, how will engineers be educated in the next 5 years? And how will we adapt our systems, educationally speaking, to, again, orient themselves more towards skill sets that are hireable and skill sets that aren't? And right now, if you've spent 4 years in school learning how to code in JavaScript or C++, you might have a really valuable framework and mental model for how to do a lot of engineering tasks, but ultimately you've sort of been disrupted. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing in the market right now.
It almost seems like CodeGen is one of the few first areas where there is massive disruption because of agents and agentic workflows. It makes you very, very curious about what's coming next and what other areas of white collar work are going to be massively disrupted. How else do you think AI is going to transform the world outside of CodeGen over the next, let's say, 5 years? What other areas do you feel are going to have massive disruption?
Yeah, great question. Well, first, I think it's important to understand why did CodeGen have sort of this perfect moment, and why was it such a great fit for AI? Among many reasons, code is entirely syntax based. It's empirical, right? Like quite literally. I mean, folks have their own style, and you hear about 10x engineers that can write cleaner, more beautiful code. But generally speaking, code either works or it doesn't. There's a massive corpus of open source code on the internet that made it very easy for these models to train on. And then also, as you think about like adoption of new technology, which AI is a great example of, engineers are generally speaking going to be first in line to try new things, right? Because they're computer native, they're internet native. They're used to quite literally downloading and running novel things on their local machines. And so for a variety of reasons, that made a lot of sense. I struggle to find second examples or third examples that are perhaps as seamless of a fit as CodeGen, but I'll say one, back to our earlier conversation, I think education is going to have a crazy amount of change as we reconsider not just what students can and can't do in a school setting, but what can they learn from AI tools versus from going to school, and therefore what skills do we now value versus no longer value out of a student. And I'm talking elementary school all the way through secondary school and college. But I think that's one area that from both a product, a capability, and from a regulatory and policy standpoint is going to need to evolve quite rapidly. I think maybe to be a little more boring in like the B2B context, what we're seeing a lot of are as far as white collar jobs are areas like legal and like healthcare, where there is a very specific set of domain knowledge, right? And these are people that went to graduate school in lawyer and doctors cases. We're talking 3+ years of graduate school, where models often can really, really augment and supplement those folks' work because they understand inherently a massive volume of either cases or research papers. And so I think about companies like Open Evidence or Harvey that are very much built around these massive data sets, and the ways in which they can essentially just recall information that perhaps people did or didn't learn in graduate school, but ultimately cannot retain in the same way that an AI model can. So those are really fascinating use cases to me, because they're specific enough that that there's a very narrow set of data that models need to be fine-tuned and trained on. But they're also broad enough in these really high leverage profession areas that companies in those spaces can build a very unique swim lane and an interesting product suite over time.
It makes me so excited when you say that, because certainly a lot of startups will be wiped out with ChatGPT 5 or 6, but if you're building with your own data and you have your own real moat, and it's something that's truly a sticky separate product to a large language model can just create within a model update, like the examples you've shared, Open Evidence or Harvey, the growth has been significant, and I really feel like those individual white collar jobs will each have a category leader, and some of our very successful businesses 5 years from now that we're spawning multi-billion-dollar, real companies off the back of this, whether that's in recruiting or tutoring or healthcare or legal or whatever. I feel like every single market leader in B2B SaaS at the moment in one of those categories will be disrupted by an AI version of that product, or they'll need to disrupt themselves. Look what's happening with Google and like Google Search and Perplexity and them having to introduce an AI mode, which is probably extremely more expensive for them to run rather than the traditional search. But they're having to disrupt themselves, or they're potentially in a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, it is a fascinating. I mean, Google is probably the most fascinating case study right now, and sort of the innovator's dilemma, and they're very much staring down the barrel of the shotgun, so to speak, to your point, where they see how this search model is changing, and what it means for their business model, and they are also in the perfect position to go and win that market if they choose to do so. And so, I mean, that's a company that generates more in earnings in a quarter than just about any company in the world, right? And I'll be really interested to see long term where they choose to maneuver themselves as a company. But I absolutely agree with you.
You've said, David, that being AI native can make a startup more credible than a 10-year-old giant in a space. So what does it mean for a startup to be AI native? How can founders use AI in a way that genuinely makes their product stand out? Not just slapping a chatbot on the landing page, but like really building this deep into the product, building on large language models from the ground up. How can a company disrupt themselves and make the product, truly AI?
Yeah, well, I want to take a step back and maybe just explain more what I meant by that. I think, first of all, my observation, over the last decade or so, is that every 2 to 3 years there is a new set of companies in our world, usually private companies, that very much have this sort of unique halo effect around them, and that applies to the employees that work at that company. It applies to the products that they choose to be a customer of. And usually the changing of the guard in terms of who has this halo effect around them and who's in this sort of mega interesting echelon of company tends to correspond with changes in our market, wide scale changes that sort of unseat a set of incumbents and create a new one. In some cases, those changes are going to be much smaller than the advent of AI or the advent of cloud or the advent of mobile. But certainly, those three changes created a new guard of companies. But even in if you think about APIs, right, like that birthed Stripe and Segment and Twilio, right? Like, I mean, there are certainly smaller changes that create that halo effect. Obviously, I think AI is one right now, where as a result of this tech wave that's taken over our ecosystem over the last 2-3 years, you're seeing very young companies take on that sort of halo effect. And so I think what I was referring to, what I was talking about, that is, I'll give you an example. I have a portfolio company called Momentum. We have sold our product now to Cursor and Windsurf and 11 Labs and a bunch of really amazing AI companies. And actually, it matters a lot more in terms of signal to the rest of the market and interest in our company that those companies have chosen to use our product than if, SAP and Oracle and pick your public SaaS company, right? Like, no matter how big. And so I think what I was referring to is just that this notion of signal can be very fast changing and very fleeting. And especially so in a world where, to your point, if it costs a lot less to build a product and we're in this fast fashion era of software, the things that differentiate companies are ultimately signal and taste, often now marketing, community, the way that we think about communicating our product values, our team values. And so all of that stuff to me is an accelerant for the notion that we're going to use heuristics, like what are the companies that we admire most using and how do they think about certain processes? How do they do things internally? And so I think all of that right now lends itself to AI native startups being, quote unquote, more credible, right? Like everybody in the market right now is trying to play catch up on domain knowledge and best practices. And so they're going to look to the companies that seem like they know how to do this stuff best and seem like they know what they're talking about most. And those tend to be now the earlier stage companies that are obviously growing incredibly fast and raising buckets of money. And so, yeah, I very much think that lends itself to, again, like relative credibility that seems like it's flipping more towards actually many of the upstarts and newly formed companies versus many of the incumbents that canonically we'd look up to for advice and for best practices and ways of doing things.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. That's where the momentum is. That's where the growth is happening right now. A lot of the growth stage companies, they're growing, but they're not growing at the same rate as somebody that's going from 0 to 100 million ARR in a year or two, right? So having that logo on your site, clearly that's way more exciting than having Salesforce. No offense to Salesforce, we use that product. It's a great product, but it's a very different type of dynamic, isn't it?
It is, right? Like everybody wants to be the fastest growing company, so everybody's going to want to learn what the fastest growing companies are doing, right? Yeah. And so, yeah, it can be a very powerful thing.
Cool. This has been super useful for people that want to learn about AI, that want to learn about starting a company, growing one, investing. Where can people find you and learn more? X, LinkedIn, the fund's website? Where should they go if they want to go for the patch?
Yeah, I have an embarrassingly small Twitter presence that maybe will change over time. You can certainly find me there or on LinkedIn or check out firstmark.com. My profile is there. It has a bunch of ways to reach me. But yeah, thanks so much for having me, Alfie. This has been really fun.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you click the follow or subscribe button wherever you're watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Introducing Lisa, the world's first AI-powered recruiter. She's an AI agent who works 24/7, screening candidates on autopilot, conducting interviews in 30 different languages, uploading all the best candidates to your applicant tracking system. Hire 10 times faster at 90% lower cost and significantly improve the candidate experience. Visit welovealpha.com to start your free trial now.